The COVID vaccines have been rolled out, and they didn't work the way people hoped. To cover for their failure, we are being fed two dangerous lies by the media and the governments. The first lie is that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, or more precisely, that it is the unvaccinated who are spreading SARS CoV 2.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
We're still in a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
And if you read the online comments of the true believing vaccine faithful, you'll see that they imagine themselves to be surrounded by an army of dirty, unclean, unvaccinated people. And it is the fault of these people that the pandemic is still with us. Of course, if the vaccines worked the way the vaccinated people think they do, it wouldn't matter if the unvaccinated were vaxxed or not, because the vaccinated would be protected from infection. But of course, the vaccines don't work as advertised, and both vaccinated and unvaccinated people can transmit SARS CoV 2. But that inconvenient fact did not stop the CDC from trying its darndest to promulgate the lie that the vaccines did stop transmission of SARS CoV 2. The first way they did this was by cooking the books. In April of 2021, they publicly announced that they would only count cases of COVID-19 in double vaccinated people when they required hospitalization or when they died from COVID-19. Think what that means for a second. Anyone who is unvaxxed, who tests positive for COVID, will be counted as a case, whereas for those who are doubly vaxxed, only those who get very ill with COVID or die from it will be counted. That is a deliberate sampling bias which will make it look like the unvaxxed are testing positive for COVID much more frequently than the vaxxed. Another trick that some state departments of health used to cook the books was counting vaxxed and unvaxxed COVID cases starting in January or February. Keep in mind that vaccinations didn't really ramp up until the spring, so this method of counting artificially increases the ratio of unvaxxed versus vaxxed COVID positive cases. A much more interesting metric would be, say, comparing vaxxed versus unvaxxed cases for the months of July and August. Of course, this deception worked very well for the vaccine faithful in the United States who get their information from the mainstream media. But there are those who go outside the mainstream media and get their information from other sources. And they started to look at information coming from highly vaxxed countries like Israel and the United Kingdom. And the data from these countries told a very different story. Here, for example, is the data from Israel showing active cases by vaccination status in different age groups. You can see that the active cases are much higher in the vaccinated age groups. And not only that, it appears that the doubly vaxxed are more likely to suffer severe illness from COVID-19. The figures from the UK told a similar story. Like Israel, the UK vaccinated a significant percentage of its population by the summer. And yet by mid-July, the number of doubly vaxxed people testing positive for COVID surpassed the number of unvaxxed people testing positive for COVID. Surely, if the COVID vaccines did what they were supposed to do, you would see far lower rates of transmission in highly vaxxed countries, but that's actually the exact opposite of what we saw. Here are the 10 most vaxxed countries in Europe and their daily COVID case rates. Now here are the 10 least vaccinated countries in Europe and their daily COVID case rates. Of course, the mainstream media in the United States never published information like this, but eventually, something happened in the United States that broke through the media bubble. In July, a party in Provincetown, Massachusetts led to a huge outbreak of COVID-19, and it was reluctantly admitted by the health authorities there that over 2/3 of those who had caught COVID-19 had indeed been doubly vaccinated against the virus. This led to a CDC meeting, which was covered by the Washington Post, And this was basically the first public announcement by the American government that the COVID-19 vaccines did not work to stop transmission of SARS-CoV-2. The article quotes an epidemiologist from Columbia University who states that vaccinated people are probably involved to a large extent in the transmission of the Delta variant. The New York Times followed up with an article discussing the numbers coming out of Israel. And for the talking classes in the United States, it was now clear. The COVID-19 vaccines were a failure. All that remained was for the CDC director to go on the air and blame the entire failure on the new variant.
But what about all the fully vaccinated people who get the breakthrough infection? Can they pass it on?
So yes, they can with the Delta variant.
Of course, this was not news to scientists who were paying attention. For example, a group in Singapore had studied the amounts of virus found in the noses of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated and found that there was no difference in concentrations of virus, meaning that the vaccinated were equally as infectious as the unvaccinated. Another study found that the vaccine did nothing to prevent the virus colonizing the nasal passages of those who had received the COVID vaccines. And some scientists speculated that because the vaccines reduced the somatic symptoms of COVID-19, they actually increase the transmission of the virus because people will not be aware that they are sick with it and they will go outside and spread it. And this appears to have been the case when an Australian socialite who was doubly vaxxed spread COVID-19 to dozens of people at a party he attended. And CDC Director Walensky appears to admit this possibility in this interview with Wolf Blitzer.
You get COVID, you're fully vaccinated, but you are totally asymptomatic. You could still pass on the virus to someone else. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And
So it's clear that the first of the two lies is utterly baseless. This is not a pandemic of the unvaccinated. In fact, it may be that the vaccinated are spreading SARS-CoV-2 more readily than the unvaccinated, because the vaccines mask the symptoms of the disease. And this brings us to the second great lie, that the unvaccinated are somehow variant factories. In order to assess this claim, we have to go back and review our evolutionary biology. You will recall that through the processes of evolution, species become adapted to their environments. Let's take the classic example, how giraffes evolved from ancestors who had shorter necks. In the original environment, there were plenty of leaves within reach of the shorter-necked giraffe ancestors. But then something happened in the environment to reduce the number of leaves accessible to the shorter-necked ancestors. Maybe there was a blight, or maybe the sheer number of individuals competing for those lower down leaves made them harder to get. In either case, this change in the environment is called a selection pressure. And a selection pressure works on the natural genetic diversity of a species to choose for a particular trait. And in this case, it selected for individuals with longer necks who could reach the higher leaves, while those with shorter necks starved and did not pass their genes to the next generation. The main point here is that it is a change in the environment that causes the evolution of a species. Now, how does this apply to the evolution of viral variants? Well, think about it. From the perspective of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, we are the environment of the virus. When the virus made the jump into the human species, it was already perfectly adapted to the human body, most likely because it was created in serial passage experiments in the Wuhan Institute of Virology in humanized lung tissues from another species, most likely ferrets. The point is, the virus did not have to evolve and did not have to make any changes to its structure to colonize human beings. Now, let's think about how vaccines work. Vaccines work by training the immune system to recognize pathogens. In the West, the two most popular COVID vaccines are those manufactured by Pfizer and Moderna. Both of these are mRNA vaccines, unlike conventional vaccines, which present an entire pathogen, usually an inactivated version of a virus or a bacterium, to the immune system. The mRNA vaccines take just a tiny section of the code for the entire SARS-CoV-2 virus. In this case, the section that codes for the spike protein. And they smuggle it into the body's cells inside a lipid nanoparticle, where it hijacks the cellular machinery to create trillions of copies of those spike proteins, which are then distributed around the body. The immune system then learns to recognize the spike protein as an invader, and it is ready to mount a defense whenever those spike proteins show up, presumably in a future infection with SARS-CoV-2. So now you have to ask yourself, which would be the environment most likely to lead to the SARS-CoV-2 virus evolving into new variants? The original unvaccinated human environment, where the immune system is essentially sleeping on the job and unaware of the danger posed by a pathogen bearing spike proteins on its outer membrane. Or a human environment where the immune system has been trained to be hypervigilant against the appearance of any pathogen bearing spike proteins on its outer membrane. In the former case, no evolution is necessary to allow SARS-CoV-2 to flourish in the human environment, whereas in the latter case, significant evolution is necessary in order for the virus to flourish in the vaccinated human environment. Specifically, we would expect to see evolutionary changes concentrated in the region of the spike protein, because that is the only region that the mRNA vaccines train the immune system to recognize. Faced now with a population of human beings in which the immune system is hypervigilant against the spike protein, you would expect the virus to evolve in the direction of a less prominent spike protein, and that's exactly what we're seeing. All of the important variants that we talk about, including the Delta variant, have significant mutations to the spike protein, and several scientific papers have confirmed this. Thus, the claim that the unvaccinated are somehow variant factories is the exact opposite of the truth, and anyone making this claim is simply revealing their complete lack of understanding of evolutionary biology. To sum up, both vaccinated and unvaccinated people can spread COVID. The only people who can't are those who've had COVID and recovered. And the source of the viral variants is the selection pressure applied to the virus in the bodies of vaccinated people. So keep this in mind this fall and winter, when COVID cases and deaths are rising. The governments and the health agencies that pushed these failed and variant-producing vaccines on the populations will be eager to find a scapegoat, and they will happily point you in the direction of the unvaccinated, with statements like, "This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated." Do not fall for their lies. What they are doing is trying to whip up a genocidal hatred in their populations. That's right, I'm talking to you, Joe Biden. I'm talking to you, Justin Trudeau. What you are doing is an unspeakably evil thing. What you are doing is what those radio DJs did in Rwanda, when they incited the massacre of over 500,000 Rwandans.
À tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.